You know, brethren, we had quite an interesting discussion last night. And it set me thinking how it is that God is in control of every aspect of our lives. Even those areas that we're not even certain about. And there are things that happen around us, like when we began our exhortation on Sunday, where God is trying to get our attention. It's through music. It's through the little baby in class. It's the neighbor. It's everywhere. And the thing is that our minds are working on such a human level that we're missing a lot of the clues. It's like sometimes the Lord has to smack us in the face to wake us up and go like, yes, Lord, that's you. And so when we think about the context of our performance or what environment we happen to find ourselves in, and realizing that those are the places that shape us. And when we are in the wilderness of life, like our brother described, in those refugee camps, in places where you're not allowed to move about, when you're running for your life, when you have nowhere and nothing else left, you begin to ask yourself, who am I? And that question should really be based on who your God is. And then you might ask another question, where do I belong? Do I have a specific place that I can find refuge? And what am I becoming? Because you see, right now, the things that we are doing is the judgment. Think about it for a second. Everything that is happening, we're told that all things work together for good, for them that love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. So even the bad moments are for our good. And so we did talk about the brain and how powerful it is, and how you have these brilliant folks out there that believe that they are God. But Isaiah 55 verse 8 to 9 reminds us that God says, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, my ways are higher than your ways. And that we are but just a drop in the bucket. And that as we think even about the way we think, we realize that in order for us to be truly effective in a spiritual way in this life, we're told in 1 Corinthians 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, that we have to take our thoughts captive. In other words, whatever we're thinking, it may be stinking thinking. That's the term we use when we're dealing with folks who are dealing with alcoholism and recovery. Stinking thinking, meaning that your thoughts are not helping you, they're hindering you. And you have to realize that. So we want to explore some different aspects of who we are, our intrapersonal relationships, our interpersonal relationships, to answer the questions, who am I? We want to learn sometimes by examining what are our values, our goals, our needs. How do our emotions work? And you know, if you've worked in any type of hospice setting, looking at end of care life, you would have heard of Kubler-Ross. And this was a psychologist that looked at the various phases of grief. And she described them in 5 stages. She talks about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. And what you find is that a lot of times when we're going through life at such a pace, we don't even have time sometimes to reflect. And when we look at the model, we find that the very environment we are part of, when we lose something or someone, it can really hit home. And it can be a turning point in our lives, for better or for worse. And so when we look at those various stages that has to do with stage 1, something really terrible happens. And we go into a state of shock. And it's like, I always think of it as you being in a cocoon. You hear someone dies that are close to you, and immediately this blanket covers you. And you're like, you know I have to make funeral arrangements. I know I have to call a brother so-and-so. But you're walking around in kind of like a daze. And that's for your protection, not initial shock or denial. It protects the individual from that loss. And we realize that it slowly diminishes over time. And then there's the bargaining phase, where we start to reason, what could have been done to prevent the loss. And sometimes if the relationships are not right, we become guilty because we feel as if we could have done something to prevent this from happening. And if this is not resolved, we can go into a deep depression. And there are many folks, I remember working with a woman who was screaming to the top of her lungs, and everybody ran to her room to find out what was happening. And it was just to learn that she was talking about her husband who had died. And we were like, oh, we're so sorry. When did he die? She said 5 years ago. Now, that's a problem. If you're in a phase where 5 years later somebody's passed, and it's like it just happened to you, then you have not resolved the issues. There can be no healing when those issues are left unresolved. And then there's anger that can resolve and result from situations that are not resolved. The feelings of guilt. You can't resolve it, so you get angry and you start blaming everybody. You go to the rehab center or the nursing home and you blame all the nurses, you blame the doctors. You go to the funeral home and you blame the people for not having the roses right and you didn't fix my mom right. Look at the way, but then you never visited her when she was sick. And I find in these spaces, some of the people who makes the most noises are those who were not part of the life of that individual the way they should have been. And finally, if you don't get to that 5-year mark and resolve it, there's some level of acceptance. And you begin to integrate the range of emotions into your life experiences. And then healing can occur. So think about the children of Israel in the wilderness. A whole generation having to deal with death and dying and all the stresses that they had to handle. And think about what it would have been like for them. I mean, I tell you something. After COVID, I didn't answer my phone directly anymore. There were so many requests to do funerals that I just was like, and then I didn't want to be shocked, so I would leave the phone to go to voicemail. And then after I got over the whole thing, I would call back the person and says, well, what type of arrangements do you want to make? So what we find is that the emotional self, that person, you see, because the interpersonal interactions that we have, of course, it has to be between two or more persons. The rest, it wouldn't be interpersonal, right? Two or more individuals. So it's not just you talking to yourself. It's you in a relation with someone else or in a group like this, or the family and the ecclesia. And the intrapersonal relationships are the ones that you have internally, your self-talk. What are you telling yourself, right? And so the emotional bonds that are created in interpersonal relationships starts first in the family. What type of relationship did you have with your father, with your mother? It's based on blood and marriage or adoption. And it has to do with friends, those non-romantic relationships involving mutual affection, trust, and support. And then we have romantic partner, intimate relationships that are characterized by love, attraction, passion, and commitment. Then we have our work colleagues, those professional relationships. And then there's simply platonic relationships. It's non-romantic in connections, but there's those relationships that are just surface level. And then when you look at the intrapersonal relationship, you look at you, how self-aware are you? Do you know your body language? We're trained as experts. There's some people in here, since I walked in, I could tell what some of them were thinking, some of the brethren. You don't believe me? I can tell those who are introverts, extroverts. I can tell those who are a little standoffish, those who are more hugging, those who are more interconnected. You're speaking when you don't even speak with your face. You don't realize it. You're sitting there and you're sending messages. Are you self-aware? How is your level of self-esteem? How do you feel about yourself? How do you regulate yourself? After a certain amount of time in the room, you want to get up and leave. Can you control that level of self-regulation? So intrapersonal relationships are different from interpersonal relationships Because you have to make sure that you're right with yourself internally before you can begin to develop and interact with others. So, what happens when things don't go according to plan? What do we do? You see, Moses and Aaron were the leaders, weren't they? They were there in that brutal, hot, arid desert region where there was little water. And the people kept asking them questions like, why did we leave Egypt? We could have been there doing fine. Then there was death in the family. We're told right there in verse 1 of chapter 20 of Numbers that Moses' sister dies. They lose the matriarch in the family. Remember the significant role that Miriam had played in the life of Moses, keeping him safe since he was an infant. And Miriam, she was the prophetess that led the women in singing and dancing. She was a woman of substance. And she was singing unto the Lord gloriously, had thrown the horses and the riders in the sea. She was a choir director. But you notice, like one man that showed up, he did a mock funeral and he said, let me see what will happen if, what they would say to me about, if I were dead. And he sat there and he heard all these great things. And he said, you know what? Be truthful. Tell them about some of the things that I did wrong too. And so here is Miriam. She spoke against her brother once and became leprous. And we have that in our account. But Moses never held that against her. Moses had to hold the family together. He had to be skillful in his interpersonal relationships. Not only with his immediate family, but with the nation. And we saw that he needed help several instances. When his father-in-law came over and he said, Moses, are you crazy? Are you going to judge those people from day to night? You alone? Get 70 spirit-filled people. There got to be some other people in the ecclesia that can help out. That was the appeal last night, right? There got to be some other people other than the CBM, the CBMA, the CBMAC, the Asia Pacific, and all these different organizations we got. Those are just little organizations in the big spectrum of things. Brethren, we have to think outside of the box. The organizations are one vehicle, but there are many talented individuals who are working in different spaces. We have to bring them all together so that they can interact in ways that are productive to the meeting, to the whole body of Christ. So it wasn't all good. Rest in peace, Miriam, but it wasn't all good. You see, in the wilderness, we're told, some of the researchers says that there were over 1 million Israelites that died. 1,078,000 Israelites died during the wilderness journey over 40 years, including 600 men, 400,000 women, 45,000 Levite men, 33,000 Levite women, plus adults among the mixed multitude. According to tradition, this harrowing ritual was repeated annually for 40 years, until the original 600,000 Israelites who left Egypt finally died off. And we know the remnant was there: Moses, Aaron, Caleb, Joshua. And then we had all this generation that were under 20 years old. How did they respond? Do you think they were sensitized or desensitized to what was happening around them? When you work in an environment, I first remember the first patient that died, everybody stopped doing what they were doing. We were so sorry. And then after a few years, you hear someone die and it's like, oh my goodness, patient so-and-so died. Okay, back to work. We've become totally desensitized. I mean, it's like it has no meaning anymore. It didn't have the same impact like when you heard about the first patient that died. You see, in Numbers 21, it says, in the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin. The word means prick. And they stayed at Kadesh, the sanctuary, the meeting place. There Miriam died and was buried. And you see, grief can have a boomerang effect. When someone dies, there are people who respond differently. Some, they go back to work almost immediately. Others are so devastated, seems like they just need to stay home. And recently at work, we heard on the news, this chapel went down and several servicemen were killed. And I didn't see the guidance counselor show up for like a day or two, which is rare. And then right away through the grapevine, we heard it was her brother that died. I mean, they had a huge funeral in New York. The governor and everybody was involved. And then there was this teacher who was pregnant and was carrying her child for months. And I would see her sitting on the step, trying to bring the kids to the bathroom, and there she was up until almost the day of the pregnancy. Then everybody rejoiced because they got the news she gave birth. And then a month later, the baby died. And it was like, we had so many deaths that year whose father didn't die, who did. But then, like 2 weeks later, the social worker, the guidance counselor showed up to work. I said, wow, you came back early, you have more time. She says, when I stayed home, I just felt like the level of grief I was feeling was too much that I could bear. I had to get back to work. I never saw the teacher until the end of the year, the last day of school. In fact, it was the end of year celebration that they had that I saw her, and she said, I just couldn't make it back. This was months later. She can't come back. It's still something in her that cannot overcome what she's been through. So we find then that when these unstabling moments arrive in our lives, certainly we see that in the book of Acts. Paul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus, and the question that he's being asked is, why are you kicking against the pricks? In the wilderness journey, when they got to that point of their journey, they were up against the pricks. They were facing it. You see, the phrase is interpreted metaphorically, warning that resisting God's will is futile and painful, like kicking against a sharp goad or thorn. And Saul's encounters with Jesus led him to a conversion portion of his life, a transformation into a devoted follower. As we look in Acts chapter 9, verse 5, this was the hope of the wilderness experience, that these things that they were going through would improve their interpersonal relationships, beginning first with the intrapersonal relationship within the individual, coming to a point where they begin to be transformed spiritually and become devoted followers of the Lord. But different people respond differently. So the first one we look at was denial. Who am I? The question is asked. Am I going to remain in denial for the rest of my life? When we found, I found this commentary. It says the ties to the community when Miriam's death happened. It was a point that the apathy to Miriam's death equated grief with thirst, comfort with water. Miriam's death had left a gap in the first family's life. How about us? It's ironic that here is Miriam dying, and in some ways she was considered like the mother in Israel. Her role is so critical as the choir director, inspiring and leading the women, and she's dead. And there's that gap left. So it's like them now facing this, not only the desert, but no water. And can they be comforted with water? That's the next question. So we may ask ourselves, what incident or incidences in our lives we are failing to address that kept repeating itself, maybe the first year of our life, 10, 20, 30, 40, that must be addressed. You see, Miriam not being there, we're told, was one of those short mourning periods. The people just moved on. Miriam was dead and she was buried, and they continued the journey. Now, if we're in denial, we could find ourselves in that space where we don't want to acknowledge the death. Maybe it's a death of a relationship that we created the problem, but we don't want to acknowledge it. We're still in denial. I was the one that created the problem. We're waiting for that person to come to us to actually resolve the issue, when in fact, Scripture says we should be going to the person. So even if you're not the one, the best practice or the best principle is to get out of the denial and to go address the issue. And by the way, denial is not that river in Egypt, right? The Nile. So you got to be able to step up to the plate in order to address these issues, right? And then we see anger coming into play, the second one. In the heat of the moment. No pun intended. It was hot in the desert, right? The whole community was very upset and annoyed. There's no water. Imagine all of us showing up at the ECBS and no lunch the first day. I know Brother Jim would have had to put on his running shoes. Because everybody would have been charging. Where's that brother that invited us? Where's the food? Right? And believe you me, I've been in scenarios where brothers and sisters in some camps where there's not enough food, and the most spiritual brother or sister that you thought about was the one that became the most aggressive. No food? Forget about, brother X and Y. So what am I becoming? That's the question. The only way you know what you're becoming is under these circumstances. When we're sitting here all calm and nice, right room temperature, well fed, we don't know what we're becoming actually. Are we that frustrated, angry diplomat? How are we going to operate when the situation and the circumstances change? Can we break the chain reaction when there's no water? How about Moses? He knew he needed to ask for help. And so Moses and Aaron asked for help, and they were told to speak to the rock. And when God asks us to do something, we know that it's the right thing to do, don't we? I mean, we read the scriptures. There's hardly a person here that doesn't know most of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. But knowing and doing is two different things, aren't they? I mean, sometimes knowing is really our conviction, because we really don't want to do it, but we know it. And we're like, man, I wish I didn't know this, because I really don't want to do it. So here is Moses, the meekest of men. I mean, this is the way he's described. And he goes out of character. You rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Moses was angry once in the first 40 years of his life. Remember that incident? When he felt that his brethren were being ill-treated, and he went out and killed the Egyptian. That's how I felt years ago when I heard our sister Carol in Guyana was murdered. I mean, I felt like if I had some weapon, I would have used it right there. Thank God I was in Georgia, Atlanta at the time. But that's how I felt, like a reflexive response. You just want to do something right there, And that's what happens when trauma come into your life. You don't respect or respond sometimes the way you should. So Moses comes out, like he's on base number one and slaps that thing. And we find that in order for us to deal with the second phase, we got to know our triggers. Do you know what triggers you? I mean, by now you should, if you've gotten to a certain age. You know what triggers you, what gets you upset. And once you recognize what those things are, then you got to either pray and ask God to help you to get out of it, or refrain yourself from being in certain situations. But sometimes you can't help. Because remember he said, first year, 10 year, 30 year, 40 year, am I there yet? How are we going to know if you're there unless we put you in the environment where there's no water? So in the wilderness of life that we're going through, right now we got to know our triggers. We meet somebody, we don't know why we don't like them. Why don't I like this person? It reminded you of your father that might be dead 30 years ago and you don't even realize it. Something about the person that's striking a negative chord in you and you don't realize it. But you're supposed to be responding in love as a brother or sister in Christ. But there's something that is happening that is intrapersonal to you that you don't yet recognize. So you got to know your triggers. So the Lord said to Moses, because you did not believe in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. They were at Kadesh, remember? And so, think about this. When we fail to follow God's instruction to use His word, we go right back to the lexical hypothesis we talked about in the beginning, right? We begin to use words that we become. So, we begin to reflect those things that are not God-given. We don't give God the glory. We know that the rock represented Christ. We learned that years ago. Christ would only be dying once. There's no need to kill him twice. But yet still we're told there are certain things we do in our lives that we can re-crucify the Lord afresh. Right? There are things that we could be doing. So in our lives itself, We've got to be careful that we're not striking our brethren and sisters with our commentary, with the things we say. Words can be considered as abuse. I mean, the first time we went online, there was this brother, very strong personality. He would say things and do things. You got to talk to him in person. He went online doing the same thing. I said, you're going to be charged for online abuse. But this time we can't help you because it's all out there in the world. The things you're saying out there, people are going to hold you accountable for those words. So watch it. And after then, he ceased and desisted. I was happy. Because you see, online, it's not just this little ecclesial world now. We got to be careful. So there were the waters of Meribah. There were the waters of strife, where Israelites were quarreling with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. They were blaming God for every single thing under the sun. How about the bargaining phase? When we can't find outlet for our grief, like Moses and Aaron, striking the rock, the foundation of our intrapersonal problems, we begin to look at it and ask ourselves, is it me or is it you? You know, the guy that wants to leave the girl, what does he say to her? It's not you, honey, it's me. That's his escape route, right? It's not you, honey, it's me, right? He's reversing the psychology. He's putting the blame on himself, but because he wants a way out. A lot of times what we find happening is that when we become frustrated, we begin to do that power play. Do you know who I am? I am the XYZ from ZYX, and you better listen to me. What happens is that rather than facing, remember we talked about it, don't fake it, face it. Rather than facing our own insignificance in the face of the problem, we began to exalt ourselves, to act like who we're not. Moses made that mistake. You see, as a result of that, he had to stay out of the promised land. But God allowed him to view it, right? He allowed him to see it so that, as we were reminded, eye had not seen nor ear heard the things that God had prepared for those of us who love him. So in our frustrations, in our own inability to deal with grief and stress and all these other things in lives, we've got to sit down and try to figure out where we're going. We saw Moses bargaining with God. God, please, let me go into the land. I brought these people all the way from Egypt. God says, you're going to see it. Go on top of the mountain, look down, and you know, he'd been to the top of the mountain. Moses ends his life on the mountaintop, seeing the kingdom. It wasn't a loss. It was just that when we can't get our intrapersonal self right, it begins to explode in our interpersonal relationships to such a negative way that we offend God. And when we offend God, we're in danger of not being in the kingdom. Because it says, as much as you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. So it's not the important guy. It's the little baby that needs a little bit of water, both spiritually as well as physically. So in the phase of bargaining, we can bargain as far as we can. And there are times when we don't like the outcome, and we can become depressed. Moses accepts. This is where my course ends. I've bargained with God. I've got to move on. And so he has to deal with the political structure of Edom, who were denying the ambassadors of God passage. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh, or Kodesh, meaning sanctuary, a place in the desert. Within the desert, remember he said there are oases in the desert? There was the ecclesia of God right there. But the king of Edom would not allow them passage. He's preventing them from getting to the promised land. So you got issues within the ecclesia of God, internally, in the brothers and sisters themselves that they have to resolve. And then there's issues with relationships within the ecclesia that has to be resolved. And then there's issues with the world at large that has to be resolved. And each one of them has to be dealt with a measure of spiritual discernment and wisdom and understanding. And so when Moses sends these messengers, we realize that God had strong respect for Edom or Esau. We read this in Deuteronomy. We're told not to abhor him. Amos 1:9 says, recall the brotherly covenant Israel had initially with Edom. And as they're coming from the south, they're coming down and they're entering, and they're there in Jordan opposite Jericho, and they have a few options. They have to either deal with the interpersonal conflict that's going to arise among the brethren so that they could continue on the journey. So Edom has two options: allow Israel to pass or maybe join them. And that's the option of the world. We're dealing with our own systems. We got to deal with the world system. We say to the world, is either you allow us to pass through or you join. If you can't beat them, join them. So this is the message of the gospel. It's saying, believe and be baptized or be damned. There's no middle ground. But the people who are bringing the message have to be able to resolve the issues and not go into a deep depression. I mean, you hear people. The other day, we're doing some fundraising to do some work. I think I'm going to mention it in South Ozone Park. I sent out some letters. A brother sent back, says, Brother Tyrone, can you tell us a little bit more about your ecclesia? I said, no problem. Let me go look for the people who've been around longer than I have. So I started to check with folks, because we were in the old meeting hall in the 90s. Before then, there were people there however long. We've been there 100 years. If you count the Jamaica meeting and the South Ozone Park meeting. So they was there long before I was. So I called up a sister, said, Sister, can you write up a little bit about the history? She said, Brother, I would be traumatized, she said. She said, some of that history I don't want to relive. She said, call Sister so-and-so. I said, okay, I understand. And I called up the other sister. She said, sure, Brother Tyrone, I'll give you, some of the stuff. We got there in Jamaica in 1995. We got to Brooklyn in 93. And then in 2000, we got a new hall. It was larger, bigger for the increase that was happening. We moved over in 2000. But imagine this now. This sister says, I'm not prepared to go back into depression because of some of the interpersonal relationships that we had back then that affected us terribly. So it is difficult to move on if we have not resolved those unresolved issues. So this is the message. This is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come on us. Our ancestors went down into Egypt. We lived there many years. The Egyptians mistreated us and our ancestors. But when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our cry and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. They knew the history. But it's just being recapped so that it is clear that the message that they're hearing from the ambassadors are clear. And you realize those under 20 who have survived leaving Egypt and Moses would have been there too traumatized by a lot of what was happening. But they could not move on unless they tried to resolve this issue with their brother. A lot of times we get stuck. Sometimes we get stuck. Have you ever felt stuck like, I can't move on? I feel so depressed in this ecclesia. I can't move on. So what do some people do? They transfer to another ecclesia. Have you ever seen that happen? Now, let me ask you a question. When you get to the next ecclesia, if you get a repeat of the same problem, what are you going to do? Transfer to a next ecclesia? And then when you get there, if there's the same problem, what are you going to do? Transfer to the next ecclesia? Then what's going to happen? You can keep transferring for the rest of your days? Is there going to be a point where you stop and look in the mirror? Ask yourself the question, am I a part of the problem or part of the solution? Where do you get to the point where you have to ask yourself some difficult questions? Because it could be the ecclesia's problem, or it could be that you're the problem. I'm the problem. And so you got to stop and ask yourselves hard questions. These are critical points. So when they were at Kadesh, this meeting place or sanctuary, this tongue at the edge of the territory of Edom, and they're asking questions like, can we pass? We have to go through, we will not go through your field or vineyards or drink water from any well. We will travel along the King's Highway and not turn to the right or the left until we have passed through your territory. What they're saying is that, brethren, we want peace. And isn't it hard sometimes the more you try to avoid certain situations, the more sometimes it comes in your face. It says as much as is possible, live peaceably with all men. But the environment sometimes doesn't allow it. You might be the one trying to be the peacemaker, but every time you say peace, they say war. How do you deal? So you have to remember there's the angel, the divine and the human ambassadors. God was sending his angel there to lead stuff. So eventually, the will of the Father will work out. Don't get depressed. Don't get frustrated. Don't get stuck. You see, when the king responded, he says, you may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with a sword. And the Israelites replied, we will go along the main road. And if we or our livestock drink any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else. And again they answered, you may not pass through. Then Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army. And so since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. Sometimes the best course of action is to just walk away. Turn away. You can resolve the issue, turn in the cheek, maybe just turning away. And so that was the course of action. We saw with the other nations, they fought with them. They had to fight some of these folks. So you got to be focused on when the time is the darkest. What do we do? When the ducks are not lining up. When everything is not in order. When the final phase of the journey seems to be the hardest. It's not time to get depressed, brethren. What we heard last night was the good news coming out of Africa. We heard that there are many people seeking to be baptized. We heard that all we need is to put our resources in that direction. We heard that those who are listening to these talks that want to be ambassadors for Christ now have new opportunities. You see, for every problem, there's an opportunity. I tend to call it opportunities. I know it might not be in the dictionary, but that's what it is. You got a problem, you got an opportunity. You combine the two, you got a opportunity. What are you going to do? Are you going to take opportunity and use it wisely? Or are you going to sit there and get stuck? So Israel as a nation is now marching from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. Journey is not easy. As you recall, the first part of the journey, they had been delivered from the Red Sea to Sinai. And now the second phase from, they got to Sinai and they made their covenant agreement with the Lord and, became his people. And now in Kadesh, their meeting place is being sanctified. And there, after 40 years, they're ready for the last phase. Don't you feel like that right now? We're in the last times. Like any moment, these guys in Russia could go extra crazy. They could just lose it complete. Combined with China, even more crazy. You throw in South Korea, oh man, it's nuts. Right? Israel is losing their minds on the other hand. They said, we'll bomb the daylight out of Gaza. A little strip like this. All they got to do is throw 2 big bombs and there goes Gaza. And then all the Hezbollah and all the other people are just going to jump up and say, let's fight. And then you got people who want to become presidents who are like dictators who just want to take the country and send us down a slippery slope. So we are living in exciting times. Any moment the whole thing can erupt. The last phase of the journey. The question is, what will you be doing and what would I be doing during all this stuff that's happening? Are we going to be the ones stuck? Or are we going to accept our lot and use it to the best of our God-given abilities? You see, when Aaron died in the 40th year, it's recorded in Numbers 33, verse 38. We see in Miriam's case, they had to move on really quickly. But they mourned for 40 days when Aaron died. Maybe they learned their lesson, or maybe they just had more time. But the point is this, Aaron had to make a transition before he died. He handed over the priesthood to Eleazar to bring them up to Mount Hor. And they stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son. And Aaron was gathered unto his people and died there. And we see, in contrast to the earthly priesthood, we have our Lord Jesus Christ in the priesthood of Almighty God, who doesn't have to die again. He is tasked with taking us that last phase of the journey into the promised land. He was the rock that was on the journey, symbolized there as Christ, who can supply us with the eternal waters of life that will fill our bellies like we read of in Revelation, will never die again. So when you get to this point of acceptance, you realize that you can't lose anymore. You can weather the storms of all those phases of grief that we have to go through, brethren. All the different emotions that we have to encounter. And the Lord reminded them that Edom was their half-brother. Needed to be handled with care. In history, how do we see our cups? Is it half full or half empty? Do we remember the positive interpersonal relationships in the past with the brethren? Or is it so traumatic we don't want to recall it? It will depress us. Let's see the cup this morning as half full. Let us remember the good times. You know, we tend to remember only those bad things that happen in life. Let us remember the good times we had with those brethren. And even maybe after we've done with this weekend, give that brother or sister a call. How are you doing, brother or sister? We've had opportunities to go to Buffalo to be with some of our new brothers and sisters. Wherever we may be led by the Spirit, wherever we feel in that call, brethren, let us use it aright. Let us see the brothers, not just as half-brothers, but as an opportunity to fill the cup, fill their cups. And so Joshua had to take on the new leadership. It was transitional time. But with history repeat itself, you know, we have, like our brother jokingly referred, 11 different denominations. Whether we mended or unamended. The thing is this, are we stuck? Are we stuck in the debate so we can't move on when the most important work needs to be done in the fields and we're stuck? Are we conscious of where we're going by understanding what is following us? The angels are there in the ecclesias, and they're watching how we're operating. And the question is, are we going to be challenged at these levels and do not have the adequate skill and ability to perform the tasks we've been given? You see, it's not just by trial and error training. We are going through what we see here as being equipped to manage or not being equipped to manage. You know, a couple of weeks ago, after we finished camp at Lake Taconic, but then I just said, oh, Brother Tyrone, we'll be there at the parking lot outreach with you guys in South Ozone Park the following Saturday. I was very happy. I said, Brother Nigel coming, man, we can't go wrong. Saturday afternoon, we were about setting up and the phone rings. But Nigel said, Brother Tyrone, I hate to disappoint you. There's been a derailment. Train's gone off the track. Things are going crazy. The manager can't leave. He's stuck. He can't move. Now, thank God, you know, that we're here in error and trial training. You see, there are folks that can actually have good intrapersonal skills, but no interpersonal skills. Bad management. Don't put them at the door to greet the people when they walk in. You see, we may be equipped to manage the social aspects that help to promote a productive environment if we are well trained. There are times when human resources will tell you that the contextual manner in which you perform helps to focus or provide employees the ways to overcome emotional barriers, such as shyness, lack of confidence, or the manifestation of anger in the workplace that is preventing a department from functioning at optimum efficiency. Is that the ecclesia? We've got bad management, so the ecclesia can't function optimally. Bad management produces bad production. So the opposite is true. We may need not just to try, you know, the young people come in, I can't do that. I can't do that. I said, listen, first of all, your brain just heard you. I can't do that. Your brain will give you every excuse as to why you can't do it. Let's try rephrasing that. I'll try to do it. So now we got to change the way the brain thinks. Now your brain starts to give you reasons that you can do it. Now, we got to go to the next level. Now we'll train. We'll give you the skills, and we go over and over again. Oh, I can't believe I'm doing it. Yeah, you're doing it because you trained. So the ecclesia, too long we've sat back and thought that when you got baptized, you were already a professional person. These organizations, parts of organizations, preparing to preach and all these other things, are skill sets that we need to develop. We look around, we think everybody should be a great brother. Every husband and wife should be a great husband and wife because they're quote-unquote Christadelphians. Doesn't work that way. Proverbs tells us, it gives us wisdom. It says the value of self-control is so important. It suggests that someone who remains patient and slow to anger is more admirable than a mighty warrior who conquers eternal foes. The ability to rule one's own spirit and emotion is greater victory than capturing a city. See, when Moses lost his self-control, he almost lost the ability to get into the city. In other words, inner strength and self-discipline surpasses mere physical proneness. As we look at this verse, it resonates with the idea that true strength lies not only in external achievements, but also in mastering our own reaction and emotion. It encourages us to cultivate patience, resilience, self-mastery, which are essential qualities for overcoming life's obstacles and challenges, isn't it? Very, very critical. And so when the human resource department look at you at work, they're looking to see what happens when the other worker falls down on the job if you help them up. They're looking to see if you pick up stuff on the ground when you're walking around instead of complaining. That's how you get promoted. A lot of times people don't know why they call them into the office and says, now you can be promoted. Because through those cameras and through other workers, they've been looking at your performance. So in the ecclesia of God, the angels of God, God himself is looking at the way we perform. What are we doing when no one is looking? And this is how our environment will be to our benefit, how we're taking care of it. So as we wrap up, we want to see this, that Edom said you should not pass through. Some instances we're told in Deuteronomy 25, a remnant did let Israel pass through, but they had to pay for it. And so what we want to see when we're becoming what we're becoming, are we willing to deal with the issues, or are we going to go into the flight, fight, or freeze mode? Are we willing to walk away from conflict, or are we willing to resolve the issues? What am I becoming? Only we can make that answer. So we see that as they were allowed to pass through in parts, we have to realize that Christ was also passing through. And it's the same way it serves to warn us as followers of God that we have to surrender to the will of God. We have to declare those things that are happening as is written in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, that there were examples for us to whom the ends of the world has come. And so as the unbrotherly Moabites and Edomites dealt when they wanted Israel to pay for their resources, we should not be caught in that trap. Our behavior has to be different from those of the Edomites. And when we put up a sign on our ecclesia when we go back home, put up a sign that says, Ecclesias under new management. And it means then that we will be able to act differently. Our relationships do matter with each other on this journey. And we remember Hebrews 13:7 that says, obey them that have the rule over your souls, for they must give account at the judgment. Thank you.